All right. So our guest today is Professor Howard Williams, a first in what I hope is a series of guest stars in this Patreon crowdcast. Professor Howard Williams works at the University of Chester. He is an archaeologist and has a special interest in mortuary practices in the early Middle Ages in Northwestern Europe. You want to give us kind of an orientation on some of your recent work, maybe a little bit of a spiel on some of the warrior woman stuff, maybe to kind of get things rolling?
Okay. So yeah, I'm an archaeologist in my primary focus, and my work goes beyond the Viking Age, but I've been touching on the Viking Age in my research over the last 12, 14 years. I'm based in Chester in the UK, but I've done field work both in Wales. Chester's on the Welsh border, so it's officially England, but I can see Wales from my office window. And I live on the other side of the border, so I've been working in Wales. And also I've been working in Sweden a while back and excavating some Viking sites there. So I've got an interest in the centuries before the Viking Age and then into the Viking Age. And I tend to spend my time doing my own publications and my own research, both in the field and based on synthesis of current debates and ideas, but I've also been playing through observing some of the debates going on in the latest literature, and I try not to be too vocal on ongoing research by others, but given just how sort of shall we say viral the Viking warrior woman story has gone, I thought it would be quite interesting and fun, given how digitally it was disseminated, open access online through a scientific journal, to comment on that too. So I've been one of the few archaeologists that has been wading in on that debate a little bit and adding my sort of my views and evaluations on that story, which obviously it's a very controversial in the sense that it's polarized people both in academia and outside, and I would say I'm on the more skeptical side, but I don't equally. I consider myself friends and colleagues with many of the researchers, and I hope we're still on good terms, and we're keeping that conversation going. Although they haven't sent me any hate mail yet, anyway, so I'd like to imagine I'm on good terms with them. But the idea is that I think a lot of what we do in mortuary archaeology is increasingly public facing. It has been for a long time. Both in the States and in Europe, these are sensitive materials we're dealing with. These are the bodies of once living people. And while there are different traditions of how we do that research, I think it's important to bear in mind that how we talk about the dead, whether it's people from thousands of years ago or research on the 19th and early 20th centuries, the full span of archaeological inquiry. It's really important to think about not simply whether we display them in museums or we display people's artifacts in those contexts, but also how we write about them. And so I think this story of the Viking warrior women is a kind of a microcosm of bigger debates we're having in academia about how we talk about the dead and how we debate in public our differences as academics. So it's a fun little topic, but it's not, I would like to say though, a qualifier, it's not something I've researched on. I haven't been a primary researcher on the Swedish site of Birka, or indeed in that particular region. I'm more of a sort of broader commentator on that debate.
Sure, but you have the expertise to evaluate the materials that are being presented to the public, and you're right. It has just exploded, out there, and I mean, people are still talking about it quite a bit. So if I can lead you a little bit, what kind of these broader debates is this a microcosm of?
Okay, right. Well, there's been a long debate in German and French and British and American and Scandinavian burial archaeology for over a century in how we interpret particularly furnished burials where the body hasn't been burnt and they've been interred with artifacts of various kinds, and how we interpret why those objects are going into graves. And a lot of the time, archaeologists have said, well, okay, this is something very different from what we Judeo-Christian Western traditions do with our dead, which is actually not quite true, because you talk to any modern undertaker or anybody, at least in Britain, I can't speak for the States or anywhere else, artifacts are going into graves all the time. They're going into crematoria all the time. So actually, there's a connection between our practices and our assumptions and the way we've been interpreting furnished burial, placing grave goods with the dead. And it's really interesting to see how the many challenges of whether we interpret those artifacts in religious terms, whether we interpret them as simply a display of economic wealth, or reflecting the dead person's identity in a social way, their gender, their age, their status, or is it a mix of all those things, a religious, an economic, a social, maybe even a political statement? And when you're looking at individual graves, it's incredibly problematic because you have to make a series of inferences about the dead person's identity in life, and then how they were actually treated in death. And for the Norse tradition or Viking Scandinavia, we have such a variety of different ways in which the dead are treated, burnt, buried, different levels of grave goods, that when you look at any individual grave, it's incredibly difficult to sort of read off something of their life from the way they're treated. So I was very surprised when I saw the archaeologists who I know work quite well, happy to go straight in a major publication in 2017, saying, we've got a Viking warrior woman. She was buried. Those artifacts, we've sexed the remains osteologically. No one believed us, which was outrageous in itself. But then they did the DNA. They've got a female sexed individual, of which there are some discussions, but let's take that, at face value. And then, but they're happy to go, well, this person had these objects. There's other ways we could look at it, but we're going to go with this person used these weapons. And not only they used those weapons, but they were trained. They were professional warrior was the word they used. And they went to that very much what we'd call in anthropological terms, a role theory approach, that the role of the social role of the person in life is translated into the grave. And something that we've been told for decades. I was trained in burial archaeology in the 90s at a British university, discussing these issues for over 30 years. I was trained, whoa, that's the last thing you're going to do, is assume that people are buried the way that their identity as a direct reflection of their identity in life, a kind of mirror of life approach. And so I was very surprised they went with that interpretation, not only to colleagues, but also were pitching that out there as if this is an unproblematic inference for us to make. And I saw a lot of people who didn't want this to be a warrior woman just going, no, it can't be the true, and equally reacting against it by conjuring all sorts of scenarios. Right. And I was just interested in how the way I've been approaching this data for over 30 years in a very cautious way, that you work from a population, you don't look at individual graves, you look at a broader context. And I saw just how really polarizing this debate became about how, you try to, interpret a single grave. And I don't know. There's so many levels to it, I suppose. One of the things that I think is really fascinating, if I can quickly add before, is it's very much linked to our cult of the individual, and our wish to be able to dig up ancient royal celebrities, or ancient, and for the UK, we had only a few years back the discovery of Richard III, King Richard III of England, one of our most useless and failed monarchs, but has captured the imagination for so long, particularly the idea that Shakespeare was lying and that he was a really great guy, and that he had a really ignoble end. And we've now discovered the truth of this. And the archaeological research is fascinating, and I have no beef with the archaeological investigation, the DNA work. That's all a great case study. But again, like the Viking warrior woman, it's this search for the individual, for the tasty celebrity. We want rich people. They may have had bitter and dismal ends, but we want that story. It's very seductive. And so I'm very interested in that, how we know what we know from the data, but then how do we link that into popular debates? Because I think we can quickly go awry, and we can start getting into writing little sort of just so stories about famous rich individuals. And And I think that's a bit of a problem I have with their research, not with their scientific investigation, which I think was totally legitimate, but about how the story has been spun, should we say.
Sure.
That's where I'm coming at this. And I'm not saying that they're wrong in their research. I'm not trying to denounce it, but equally, I think I'm trying to sort of get people to have a more nuanced conversation about how we interpret these graves.
And I think the point about us looking for celebrity burials is a great point. I wonder how much of that is influenced by the huge sensationalism about big Egyptian tombs.
Exactly.
And those tend to be sort of those similar sort of pre-modern celebrity. But also, I think it seems like part of your broader point is that any burial site needs to be approached with more of a skeptical attitude than people tend to, right? You find any body buried with weapons, man or woman, and the natural tendency is to say this is a warrior. But those weapons may also not be, as you say, it may not be this role theory. Is that what you're talking about? It may not necessarily reflect the person's role in life, but it may perhaps be the belongings of someone important to that person, or there may be status symbols or something like that.
And one of the really interesting things about the grave that I very much, like many archaeologists studying Viking burial archaeology, it's one of those iconic images from Stopel's excavations in the 19th century. Used in every textbook, you have this plan of this chamber grave with the spears and the axe and the playing pieces, and it's an iconic image, so we're all familiar with it. And the researchers are absolutely right to call us to account for this and say we've just been assuming this is a chieftain or a warrior's grave, and they're absolutely right to say these wealthy graves seduce us. They talk about them as typical, and we end up using them as default. Every book on the Vikings that many of your followers will be familiar with or maybe have on their shelf will have a picture of a selection. Well, they'll all have the same kind of objects, almost circulated as sort of pop culture icons. The Gumunbu helmet is the only Viking helmet we have from Scandinavia. So, of course, it's in the books. And this is another one of those examples. And so they're absolutely right to sort of say, hey, we've assumed so much about this grave and we know so little about it. Let's do some new work. And I'm totally supportive of that. And you realize that these graves don't have a direct, straightforward story to them. And I think there's all sorts of really fascinating, alternatives we could now pursue with this research and where we go with it. So I'm really, I'm really interested I'm an observer, but also I'm trying to sort of stoke things up a little bit and get them to react to some of their assumptions in their research. And I think this is going to play out for a number of years. And
I also, it makes me think about the way that people present the typical Viking funeral, and they're basically basing it on Baldur's funeral and Snorri's It looks like we got some dialogue over here on the side. There's a question from John White.
How do burials, what you regard people? Let me get my brain around this. I'm new to this. I need to process. Okay, right. So that's a good question. So I mean, there's a broader point about funerary archaeology is that surface funerary monuments can quite rapidly be destroyed, and they can be destroyed over time. When we're talking about a Northern European context, Britain has had most of its landscape radically altered in the last 250 years. So we've lost a lot of the prehistoric and early historic funerary monuments from sight. And even into historic periods, we've got, a lot of our monuments have just gone under agriculture. So the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and even right up to the Second World War. The Second World War created a crisis of farmland access. And actually, it was in the Second World War that a lot of peripheral farmland that had monuments surviving the agricultural industrial revolutions started being ploughed away. And one famous Anglo-Saxon cemetery I'm familiar with, where they tried to experiment in ploughing really rough peripheral soils in Suffolk for the first time in the Second World War by basically turning an engine of a First World War defunct submarine on its end and trying to rotivate the ground just to break it up. So, people were going to desperate measures to produce enough food for us. So through the 18th, 19th, and even into the 20th century, we've had transformations in our agricultural landscape, meaning that, a lot of burial sites that had surface traces until quite recently have gone. And the same, less so in Scandinavia. Denmark and southern Sweden a bit more. In central Sweden and Norway, obviously much more surviving uplands and rocky outcrops. But still, a lot of funerary monuments are lost. So even in major concentrations of Viking cult activity and burial, like Gamla Uppsala, they're still finding new graves. I think there was a news report a few weeks ago. So it's amazing how you can still find burials that you'd think, no one's going to forget those. Then we have the issue with the Vikings, that they were actually robbing a lot of their own graves within a generation or so. So I think there's a number of different layers that Viking period people, were already desecrating, deliberately re-entering graves, perhaps even family members, to access weapons, heirlooms. And there's a lot of interesting new research. For example, Dr. Alison Klevnes at Stockholm, she's been doing a lot of work on the level of grave robbing in Viking period graves, and come to the conclusion a lot of it is not later. Some of it is actually Viking period robbing. So,
that happens in the sagas all the time too. I mean, actually, the literature kind of calls out on the fact that they're going back into these graves a lot. That's cool.
Yeah. So the idea that there was it's like with, again, your analogy with Egyptian tombs. Well, the Egyptians venerated and respected the dead. Oh, yeah? Then why did they have to constantly put out curses against tomb robbers? Because the rest of the Egyptians were much more happy to take those stuff out of the grave. So it's graves. If you're going to put a mound over a grave, whether it's of any date, 6th, 7th century, or going back to the Bronze Age, you're declaring the presence of your dead. And that is a landmark. It can be a claim to land and ancestry, but you're also daring others. You're also challenging others to, well, not challenging, but you're putting up a statement that we're not only just putting up a mound, we're also putting up a mound, and you can't rob it because we're still in the place. We're still defending it. So I think it's a bold thing to do. And I think many of those more grandiose burial mounds, like Oseberg, the famous ship burial in Vestfold in Norway, were robbed, but they weren't robbed soon afterwards. They were robbed when there seems to be a regime change. And the speculation is that it's when the Danish kings are asserting themselves over that area of Norway. They may have been deliberately going into those burial mounds to knock out almost the power of them for the local lineage. So it's almost you could call it a desecration, but a politically motivated one to knock out the ancestors by taking away the key objects and bones. So the dead are always politicized and in this period. And I think they would have never rested respectfully in the sense of there was an agreed set of rules about how or if there were agreed rules, then people were happy to break them.
Well, and there's a larger problem with the way we look at past cultures here. We tend to say something like the Egyptians respected their dead, the Vikings respected their dead. Sure, that doesn't mean they respected everybody's dead. I mean, today you might say that contemporary Americans respect their dead, but if I find out that on my land some neighbor had buried some relative of his, I might not necessarily respect that. I don't know. It's a made up situation. But,
well, it's like Grettir and Kar the Old, or as someone else is putting in here, Angantyr. You've got these cases in the saga literature of which must be a resonance of earlier interventions, and it's not in the areas necessarily where your ancestors are, but it could be. It could be that I think it's in Grettir saga. Of course, he's an Icelander, but he's in Norway, and it's not his dead, but he's doing it for the son or something like that. There's this, there's almost a relationship there with the. You're from outside and you're...
That saga's a mess.
Yeah. But you have these kind of cases coming down to us in the saga literature, which must resonate with what we find in the archaeological record, that the dead aren't resting easy. Yeah. So it's an interesting topic.
And I think in the sagas, too, there's almost a fantasy that the dead are doing it back to us. I think about it in Jarl's saga, where after Gunnar dies, his son, outside of his mound, is reached out to by his father Gunnar, encouraging him to avenge him. And I think that's part of this sort of fantasy they have, that not only are they broaching the dead space, but the dead are broaching the living space. So that's getting into all kinds of other issues.
But it does. Sorry, go on.
Oh no, I was just seeing where our questions are over here.
Yes, sorry, I'm, do tell me if I've missed something that I should be answering, or I'm new to this thing.
Oh, that's all right. And here I'll read this one too. So if I put this up later as a video, people can also hear it, because I don't think they see. I think when this is recorded, you don't see the text at the side. So.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
So we have Simon asking, in role of psychic Gatlak Sonar, someone identified as female takes on a male name and rules part of their father's kingdom. Do you think something like this could happen? Weapons in a burial as a sign of status and office, rather than they were actually fighting.
Gosh, so, I mean, I think the thing about funerals that we have to remember across cultures is their time of identity change. And one of the things that I think needs to be, if we're going to look at this objectively with a series of options of how we interpret burial evidence, one of the things that could be done in a funerary context is you may be looking at scenarios where the dead are being dressed up to be things that they weren't, things that they hoped the dead would have become, things that maybe the previous generation had been. And so the dead person is not sitting there, you're not writing their biography with the objects you're placing. You may be dressing them up to be something that they need to be for the survivors, for the mourners. And that may be that they are giving them the objects of the previous generation. It may be that they're trying to articulate an identity that they hope they would have achieved. And so that when you come to, so I mean, I know this sounds like you're just arguing yourself out of a warrior woman, but I think there are genuine scenarios where in sort of Norse context, but also in others, where you may be looking at the artifacts placed with the dead are not just passive statements about, hey, she likes axes, let's give her an axe. You know, oh, do you remember that time when she hit that little hare at a distance with that bow? Let's recognize that in this kind of modern, everyone approaching the coffin, saying a few words, kind of modern aesthetic of a funeral. I think you may be looking at quite dramatic and quite sort of politicized acts that you are giving things to the dead that people will remember because they're shocking or challenging, or perhaps even to make clear statements about the land or the resources that the survivors want to maintain. So maybe we could be in a scenario where, dressing the dead in a role they didn't have, or in a fashion that was perhaps deliberately antagonistic. You're going to give all a selection of weapons. She may have been really good with an axe. She may have been really good with a bow. She may have been a great horse rider, but we're not really talking about that. We're giving the dead a series of objects that really say something about our status as mourners, whether they're men, women, a mixture.
No,
and so I think that, I don't know if that answers the question.
Sorry, we're crossing each other. Could I give you a hypothetical example of something that might seem possibly similar? Perhaps a child dies that would have inherited a particular position. Do you think that child, do we see children buried with tokens of position or high status or adult roles that they might not have grown into yet?
Well, we certainly see that in the Roman world, and we certainly see it in the early Anglo-Saxon 5th, 6th century context. We have some very wealthy female child graves who are 4, 5, 6 years old. We also have weapon burials, not a minority, that are pre-12-year-old. And we imagine about 11, 12-year-old is the time where you would acquire a warrior status, an adult status in early Anglo-Saxon society, or somewhere around that. If you're about 8, it's very unlikely you could use a full-sized weapon. Or 7 or 6. So, those are almost aspirational objects placed in there to project an identity that the dead never had. I'm not so sure about the Viking world. That I'm a little hazy. All I would say is that we are looking at a context where we're looking at, in the case of the BJ 581, an exceptional Viking settlement. It's the only one in the northern central Baltic. It's an exceptional. It's an exceptional burial rite with an exceptional set of weapons. We can't get into the minds of people in the past. We archaeologists can't. That's giving us the burden of expectation on us. We can't sort of do a Gil Grissom CSI moment where suddenly the past is revealed to us in a sort of, as we gaze across a crime scene. We can't do that kind of reconstruction of everything. We have to work with possibilities and probabilities. And I think with this scenario, this exceptional burial, we have to keep open a series of options, one of which is that this is actually something about a broader kin group and their assertion of an identity or group status. So I think that's not a fantastical scenario. In fact, it would be the most, in the current thinking, that would be the default argument you'd have to sort of riposte against, or why we think this is specifically the objects of this person. Did they just trip over and fall into that grave with everything they were carrying at one moment? Did they, how did that happen? I think
and there's contemporary probably analogs to that where someone might be, especially, and I'm sorry if this brings up bad memories for anyone, but especially a child's death today,
Yes.
grieving family members might project a little bit of what they foresaw for that child onto how the child's funeral is conducted, or what items they might be buried with.
Absolutely.
Let's see. I see Matthew Axvig down here. Were surviving family members motivated to raise the grandeur of their family by burying their dead with lots of weapons and wealth?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Is that we must be looking. I mean, one of the things we anticipate with any funeral is archaeologists are only seeing a selection. If you want to, I mean, I'm not saying we're relying only on this. We're relying on a lot of cross-cultural evidence. We're relying on a lot of later sources. But if we just take the accounts, which I know Jackson's done excellent video on Ibn Fadlan's funeral, we know that only 1/3 of the dead man's wealth is going into the funeral, but most of that is going on booze and feasting. Most of it is, not all of it's going onto the pyre. In that case, it's a cremation. So my point would be,
and that's in sagas too.
Yeah.
Right. Like I think about Lockstella Saga, the burial of Alder, or Owner the Deep-Minded, where so much of the wealth is not transferred into the grave. It is used to celebrate the dead and then the inheritance among the living. Right.
Yeah. So I think you've got to look at a particularly exceptional circumstance where all of their weapons or objects are going into the grave. It's going to be a selection process. Most of the weapons are going to be circulated amongst the mourners or amongst the family. And so you've almost got to think, is this a scenario when you have a very wealthy grave where it may not have been that person was more important, but where there was a reduction in the kin group, where there was actually fewer people who could inherit, that there was so you almost have to do a sort of reverse. One of the potential scenarios for a particularly exceptional grave is where something has gone terribly wrong. There isn't a daughter, there isn't a son, there isn't an extended group who want to inherit this stuff, but that it has to go into the grave. Or the circumstances of death were so disturbing or unusual that nobody wanted those objects. So we have to at least anticipate. One of the reasons why people are putting objects into the funeral, why they're making a high status funeral, is reflecting their economic status, their social network, their religious beliefs, sure. But one of the other scenarios we have to at least think about is, are the graves where we have a complete weapon set actually aberrant? Because in most of the real warriors would either not have a weapon or would have very few. And we have parts of Scandinavia, we have parts of Western Europe where we're dealing with, just as, from what all our knowledge tells us, are just as aggressively warrior cultures, if you want to use that phrase. They are martial cultures. But we don't have any weapon burials. Were they all just peaceful, loving hippies? No. Early medieval Wales, from the 5th century through to the 11th century, demonstrably from historical records, effective in battle and in deciding battles between their bigger and Anglo-Saxon rivals. In many key 7th century battles were decided by which ways the Welsh fought. Their warriors, there's no physical archaeological evidence of them burying any weapons in a grave. We have hundreds and hundreds of burials, but no one's getting a weapon. Is that because they were just, as I said, it's just because they were peaceful? No. Surely the weapons are valuable and they're being inherited. So we have this kind of problem as archaeologists. We're getting the things that people didn't want to keep amongst the living. So we have to bear that in mind. Are the really wealthy graves actually to do with social dynamics of families where things went a bit wrong and the person dying wasn't the right person, or the person dying was at the wrong time, that they couldn't continue the lineage or the family relationships in a way that was anticipated? So we have to, it's suddenly your brain starts going a bit mushy and you start thinking, hang on, what can you say about anything, Howard? But I think the point is we have to be a bit cautious about jumping to an equation of those objects are her objects. They had all their life and they happened to bury. And we have, getting back to Jackson's point, we have old objects. with very young people, suggesting that those aren't the brooches they wore. If they did wear them, they inherited them. So they're not getting just their personal art effects, so to speak.
That's an excellent point. And do you think that this is actually influenced by the way that our culture has such a surplus of items that we don't necessarily think anything of someone putting in a very nice pair of shoes or something into a grave, whereas in these cultures of much more scarcity, you're much less likely to put in actually valuable, useful items because, heck, you need that for the next winter.
I think that's a really interesting point, is that we are dealing with a selection, but we are also dealing with a selection of objects that very few, would have been circulating. And so, and this is actually quite interesting on a number of levels. One of the interesting things about it is those objects that were decided to be put with the dead person may have been unique. Every axe looks the same, you may think. Every sword looks the same. No. They all look slightly different, whether they were used just for woodworking or they were used for a range of different tasks. The item may have looked very distinctive. Now, whether it belonged to that single person or there's a story attached to it, that was the axe that was given to them at this point and now it was given to somebody else, but they're giving it back at their funeral. These items may have been circulating. So I don't think it's just simply the surplus items. It's the fact that the mass production of our society makes us forget that how what we would call an heirloom, I think almost every object would have some connotations of what we would call an heirloom. I have some of my grandfather's effects, and they are not what I perhaps planned or expected to retrieve and keep with me. Some things I could think, yeah, I remember him using that object. I remember that object on a mantelpiece. Other things I've got that are just not predictable. And a funeral, that brings another point, is not only were objects perhaps individually marked, recognizable, but they may have actually been, there's an unexpected quality to them when it gets into a funeral context. That it's not about, do you remember that axe and the cows we slaughtered with it, or do you remember the battle we won? It may be much more complex than that, and about who's doing the giving and how they're placing it. So the objects we have to look at as an ensemble. We have to think about the relationships between them. And I think that's the story being told may be very clear to the people who are at the funeral, but we can't easily tell that story by just going, look, they had a nice itinerary of objects, a nice, we have a list. Yeah. That's what they were in life. I think it's much more complicated. Sorry to be killjoy.
Excellent point. I mean, because we can't look and say, oh, that's his sister's brooch or something like that. It's just, oh, there's a brooch, right? We those stories aren't being told for us.
And I see someone here talking about coins. The tradition of the ancient world of a coin to help facilitate journeys to the afterlife. Again, being a killjoy, we absolutely have no idea what people thought about was the afterlife in 10th century Birka. We can talk generically about Valhalla and we can talk about other conceptions from later sources, but we don't know whether the people that were going into chamber graves thought something very different from the people who are burning the dead on pyres, from the people who were perhaps doing other things with the dead that don't leave a trace. So we may be looking at artifacts that were both about this world, but also about hedging bets and helping to negotiate a journey to the next world. But we don't necessarily know what the destination is.
Right. I think about all those graves that are shaped like ships or that are ships. Does that speak to some kind of watery passage to the afterworld or watery afterworld? But the literary sources don't talk about that. Our literary sources too are just a tip of an iceberg of what stories people must once have told. Just want to point out our next question that I noticed was Anders Torgerson. How much did the Anglo-Saxons and Norse borrow from other traditions like the Romans in their burial practices?
Gosh, wow, that's a big question. I would suggest in many ways, Norse stuff I'm less confident on, but from an Anglo-Saxon perspective, where it's closer to the Roman period, I think there's a lot of these cultural labels make it very difficult for us to think about long-term sinews of tradition that weave through from the Roman period into the Anglo-Saxon period. In Britain, we're kind of cursed with these period labels. We have Roman Britain and it ends. And then we have the Anglo-Saxon period begins. And actually around the North Sea, on both sides of the Channel, whether you're talking about Merovingian Gaul, the Franks, and these ethnic labels we use, we're talking about the Anglo-Saxons, they are actually following on traditions that have a presence in the Roman world. They're taken into new directions and new emphases. So I think there is a lot of inheritance. When you're getting up further north, further away, all I would say is that any Viking archaeologist will tell you, you can't really understand Viking burial practice without looking back to the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, and perhaps even further back. You've got to understand some of these recurring themes. One of the most famous Viking boat grave cemeteries that many of you will be at least familiar with the name of, Valhalla, near Gamla Uppsala. Some of the not so recent, but reasonably recent work that's been done there looking at the chronology of the boat graves. And it was assumed when they were excavated in the early 20th century that, this is a constant tradition, that the aristocracy of the area are placing their dead in boats, the males, because there's no females in boats, the females seem to be cremated, male chiefs in boats from about the 6th century right the way through to the 10th, maybe even into the early 11th century, looking like an unbroken tradition. John Ljungqvist's work has broken down the chronology, and I can't go into the detail here, but just to make the point, this tradition is not ongoing. People are stopping it. Then almost a century and a half later, they're starting it again. And it almost seems like different intensities, perhaps even disconnected king groups are going back to that cemetery. And you start to think, well, is there an unbroken tradition, or are they taking ideas that have been not practiced for 2-3 generations and reinvigorating them? And so you may be looking at lots of different boat grave traditions, and that's one site. So you may be looking at, rather than thinking about this kind of, the Vikings inherited these thousands of years of untold traditions, we may be looking at lots of different fashions coming in and out. You think of the networks of the Viking world. They were getting exposure from all over the place. So in terms of burial tradition, I think they're constantly innovating, adapting to make new statements. And even in burial grounds where we think we've got a unbroken chain of burials, I think the chronology is starting to throw up some questions about that. And maybe we're looking at people really adapting their ideas.
Well, I think about that in a more recent context too. If you go to reasonably old cemeteries in North America, the graves, this is a personal impression, but it seems like the graves up to about the middle of the 19th century are very simple. And then you have a sudden, much more ornate fashion kind of in the Victorian era. And then it seems to get a little bit more simple again in the early 20th century. And now it seems to be getting more ornate again. So these things aren't necessarily, you don't necessarily have like an ornate period and then a simple period. There may be several different threads going on, or they may go in and out of fashion, or people today may imitate some practice that they read about in a book that was done 800 years ago, right? Yeah, so that's an excellent point too.
And there's a good analogy you've made, thinking about the Roman and the Byzantine world, which is still around in the Viking Age, that they are, the traders, the travelers are the people that are bringing these knowledges in, and they're probably adapting and using traditions over a wide territory. Boat burial is quite a distinctive international tradition in the Viking Age. And it may be, a signal of your non-local identity, that you have those maritime connections. Yes, you have the status and the power and the wealth to dispose of a vessel, but you also are signaling those international connections, almost like a colonial statement. So you can see parallels between the cemeteries of the great tombs of merchants in 19th century Belfast or Glasgow and those in India. You can see the influences, the two-way influences, the British Empire and the East India Company creating those cross-fertilization in elite burial traditions. So it's not necessarily about a statement of, I am a Viking, I bury in a vote. And it's amazing, even archaeologists quite recently have defaulted that when we first found the first mainland British boat burial at Ardmurcombe in the peninsula of Western Scotland, and people said, this must be a symbol of Viking identity. And I think the last thing probably people were thinking of is, obviously in a gruff voice, going, I am a Viking. They were probably thinking about their networks of connection, their status, their maybe their afterlife beliefs, but about making that connection to a broader network of relationships rather than some kind of single ethnic label. And certainly they weren't calling themselves Vikings, but they would, they wouldn't have been calling themselves even Norse. They would have probably been trying to articulate something much more specific.
Perhaps even a cosmopolitan identity, but of course,
that's the word. Yeah,
yeah. Looking at a piece of the map, we're not necessarily aware of those worldwide trends. I mean, it's like when you're looking at and I'm always going to probably bring this back to languages and literature, right? Because it's my side of this. But like you look at literary trends in the sagas, you look at these later sagas where all of a sudden people are giving all these speeches. There's all this stuff about, what about the sort of moral decorum of these individuals. And if you're just looking at Iceland, you say, what happened in Icelandic culture that made them start doing this? But if you're looking at the wider trends in European literature, this is that chivalric Arthurian stuff that's starting to sort of leak into the native saga tradition.
Oh, absolutely. Can I answer one of the questions on the right here, Jackson?
Oh yeah.
I'm really interested. This is one of my pet things that I find really funny. The question: did they actually burn them in their boats like they show them in the movies? If they shouldn't, if so, shouldn't there be a lot of graves and artifacts along the shores and the fjords? That's a really good point, and I want to answer that question because it's one of the in a very quick way, but in a nuanced way. Firstly, there's two things we're told to denounce constantly that we didn't happen in the Viking Age. One, they didn't have horned helmets, apart from my little friend here. That there was no evidence of horned helmets. True, and there's no evidence. A lot of people tell you that they burnt the dead on boats. I think I will defer to my esteemed colleague on screen here for a discussion of the Edda, Prose Edda, and Balder's funeral, which is, I think, the model of modern popular references are coming from, the idea, but we can't find archaeological evidence for that. But to answer the lady's second question,
it's Balder, it's Ibn Fadlan, and it's Beowulf.
Yeah,
right? Which are
all mashed
all
together.
Sources, yeah, and they all get mashed together, yeah.
And it's Kirk Douglas, 1958, The Vikings, that sets this tradition in the modern world that a Viking funeral is burning yourself on water, and I've even seen it in Game of Thrones, and even this idea that you burn the dead on water. Now, I'm not saying, but I won't say, I'll tell you something, I won't say it didn't happen. Because to be honest, we wouldn't find the artifacts along the shoreline because the shoreline has moved and the ground in Scandinavia is rising out of and relieved from the pressure of the last glaciers. So everything in Scandinavia at different degrees, at different places is rising. And we might not have the evidence of a surviving in a way. We have some burnt ships. That Hedeby has a burnt ship that was burnt out to sea, and we have a few deliberately sunken ships in fjords that the Skudelev finds. But I don't know if we would. We would expect to find. It'd be great if we found it, and it may happen. But I don't think to say, oh, we have no evidence for it, therefore it didn't happen. I'm more than happy to entertain the possibility that shoving the dead out to sea, if you're really cunning and think about the tides or the fuel, and you know how to light a ship, it is possible. But I think that it's really unlikely in the style that it's shown in the 1958 film. I think it's Thor Ragnarok, the second of the Marvel films. There's this mass, all the Asgardians are being burnt on ships for no good reason. I can't remember why, but they're killed by the bad guys. But I think we've taken this to ludicrous proportions. So I'm not saying it didn't ever happen, but we have no evidence, and I don't think it would have happened other than in exceptional circumstances. Burning the dead on land in ships, we've got archaeological and the Ibn Fadlan account, archaeological evidence in the Ibn Fadlan account, no problem. But the actual pushing them out into the fjord, farewell, and firing arrows.
Yeah,
I find that difficult.
I think this is why I constantly disappoint people, and I don't have, lots more followers. Is that I'm always saying, well, we just don't know. That doesn't mean it didn't happen.
No.
But we have to and this is also part of what you're saying about the warrior woman grave. We can say, here's a grave of a woman with these items in it. We don't know, and we can never know what exactly that means. Let's distinguish between what we know and then what we're building on top of that theoretically. And let's be careful about distinguishing that. And that's a big thing that distinguishes the work of actual scholarship from the speculation about the past. That may be legitimate, true speculation, but we can never know.
I have no problem with one of the scenarios for that burial being that it was a woman who had the ability to use those weapons and deploy them in a military context. I have no prejudice against that as a scenario. There's many historical contexts, including the British Army, recent and not so recent, where women were effective in combat roles. But that's not that's about our aspirations for what we want for women today, not necessarily about what we have evidence for. And I don't think we should jump to that as the natural, logical, or we have to make this the way it was. We have to make this work, or the naysayers or claim we're just I think we have to sort of balance this. And Leszek Gadea's work I want to cite for my colleagues. One of my colleagues, he's a Polish trained archaeologist, but now working in Norway, in Bergen, and he's done a broader survey of sexed female bodies with weapons or martial objects. And his work, he's got a book coming out called Amazons of the North, which I think is going to put the BJ 581 grade in a broader context. And he's doing a lot of work. He's also working with the literary sources. I don't think that's his primary specialism, and I think, but certainly on the archaeological side, he's going to put this stuff in context. And I think there are more graves with that look like they are female-gendered, female-sexed weapon burials, whether they are evidence of warrior women or some other cultic or ceremonial or social role. He will be addressing in his work. So I think we really should wait on Leszek's forthcoming works. I think he's going to have a lot of important things to say about this.
I'll look forward to that. I think the question you were just answering was also answering. So there's this feature down at the bottom, ask a question. And there was another person who asked almost the same question. So I think you dealt with that too. Phoenix,
okay.
I've heard a theory that Valhalla became a more believed concept as people ventured further from their homes. It couldn't be buried with their families. Is there anything in burial finds that might confirm or debunk that?
So like the idea that a more pronounced idea is to do with is a product of the Viking world. Yes, I mean, I think we can say that whatever we get from the literature is all of the different winnowing and complexities that we infer from that, the challenges of getting back to the 11th, 10th centuries. We have to remember it's going to be getting back to that end of the Viking age. So these are ideas that are produced within the Viking world and spun out afterwards. So I don't think they come from the diaspora. Yes, all of these ideas probably come from societies undergoing rapid, cultural change. And adapting to new environments. So I like that idea insofar as I can't prove it or debunk it, but I like the idea that we've got to remember the Viking Age is not a period. It's like all of the early Middle Ages. It's a time of many different levels of constant change and diaspora. And therefore, what comes out at the end of it is a sort of a mess of ideas. And I bet that's one of them that comes out of, yes, a martial culture, but one that's probably very much thinking of the hierarchical society at the very end of the Viking Age, rather than something people were, had already innately cooked up in the 8th, 9th centuries. So I like the idea. I think that would be our default, to assume that this is something that comes towards the end of the Viking Age. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Jackson, or is that too cynical of me? I don't know.
No, I think it's accurate. I did a video about the afterlife and afterlife concepts that talked about this a little bit. In fact, part 2 of that was just talking about Valhalla. But if you look at that word in poetry that can be pretty confidently dated to the 800s, like Atlacrida, Valhalla is actually used there for just the hall of, I think, Gunnar. It's just a war lord's hall of the slain. It almost seems like a kind of sardonic name for a hall of warriors. The earliest, something just fell off your wall. The earliest reference for sure to Valhalla as an afterlife concept is Eriksmål, which is from the 950s. And of course, we, like you were saying, you made an excellent point. The Viking Age isn't a period, it's a spread. Talking about beliefs in the afterlife or burial practices in the Viking Age is kind of like talking about beliefs in the afterlife or burial practices in the United States. Because are you talking about 1776 in Connecticut, or are you talking about 2019 in Nevada, right? I mean, and are you talking about somebody who, is from this denomination or this background or this immigrant background? I mean, and there's so much mixing and cultural change that's going to happen during that time that there's not a monolithic belief or set of practices.
One of the things that I find most interesting about these exceptional burials, whether they're boat burials or chamber graves, whether it's understood to be a transference to an afterlife or not, it is this almost replication of a dwelling space.
Hmm.
And I think that as a theme that cross-cuts a number of different burials traditions, this is quite a powerful thing. You're actually creating a subterranean chamber where you're decking the dead out. The things that we have surviving, we have the weapons, we have the sacrificed horses. There's probably a lot of textiles going in there for clothing. There's probably a lot of food going in there. So I think when we reconstruct these things, as the artwork that appeared with the BJ581 article, we've got to pack in that grave a lot of extra stuff that we can't see: textiles, food, drink, vessels in wood, leather. And I think
go ahead.
I was going to say,
this ties into the next question I see, which is actually, with all the talk of extravagant burials, this is from Zachary Quinlan, what was the most common form of burial for an average person? So if you could segue into that.
Yeah, okay. So this is an exceptional burial rite that I think is about the place. It's about making your mark on the landscape. And while whatever spiritual ideas these people were articulating in the precise location of individual objects, they were making a mark on the place, on an important trading center. But to answer Zachary's question, we have incredible diversity across Scandinavia with various different burial traditions. Cremation for most of the Viking Age in outside of Denmark is the rule. There's a much more of a mix in Denmark, and inhumation is gathering pace, probably influenced by exposure to continental traditions. And we're looking at most people are being buried with one or two objects or being cremated, and therefore we can't really see everything they were buried, they were placed on their pyre. So we have rather more modest funerary traditions, and people's graves may be marked by mounds, but they may be marked by a range of shaped stone settings: rectangles, oblongs, semicircles, full circles, ship-shaped or boat-shaped features of different scales. So we have incredible, both in the grave and external features being utilized to mark cemeteries and graves. And the thing that I've been writing about a lot in my recent work is how we need to stop thinking about graves as individual events and think of them almost, if you use a sort of literary or grammatical analogy, almost like citations. But when you're adding a grave to a cemetery in a society before professional grave digging, before professional organization of cemeteries, before the 19th century in European cities, for example, you're dealing with a tradition where you're choosing where you place your dead to make references to earlier graves. And it may be not a citation with a single reference in it. You may be making citations to multiple earlier graves. And that as you add further graves, you're actually creating a burial community that may be in part a reflection of what you remember about who your kin are. Partly it may be fictive, that you're creating links to people who you don't even know is in that grave, but the tradition emerges. Maybe it was a distant unrelated cousin, but you're putting your dead next to them. You're making a citation, you're making a reference to an earlier grave. So if you go to Scandinavia and see some of the better preserved cemeteries, they are a mess today, but they're a mess that may have already been a bit messy in the period, in the Viking Age, of multiple farming communities coming together, using the cemetery, referencing each other, referencing their kin, referencing their allies, their neighbors. And you're looking at almost a really complex genealogy played out in material terms. And I think that rather than constantly agonize over whether we can decode the identity of any individual grave, we can think about citation. Now, if you apply that, just quickly, if you apply that to BJ581, this is one of those powerful things that I think comes out of the Hedin-Sternia Jonsson and Price et al. Articles, is that this grave, whoever the occupant was of that grave, they were in a cluster of chamber graves with weapons. So whoever this person was, they were joining a community of the military or martial dead on this prominent headland by the hill fort. So whoever these guys and gals were, they were making a very overt statement as a group about their identity. Now, whether they were all women, all men, or a mixture, whether they actually use these weapons or not, I think that's the story we can tell as archaeologists, rather than getting into an endless, ever-decreasing spiral of discussion about the occupant of any individual grave. So I think, to get back to your point, Zachary, about the average person, every average person was buried with only a few objects, but maybe they were constantly making allusions back to earlier graves, and the place, the exact precise spatial positioning mattered a lot. And Neil Price has written about this a lot, actually, as well, and a number of other archaeologists. It's not just my idea, but I think that's a really profitable way of thinking about these graves, not just simply as atomized units where they're displaying the identity of that dead person, but as constantly thinking about the past, making reference back to earlier burials.
And I wonder if something like what you're talking about there at Birka is almost a claiming of that fort or that area for the people that are being buried there, like or a claiming of something else in that vicinity.
Yeah, I'm not an intimate knowledge of the Birka site, but what I'd visited many years ago. And one of the things that interests me, I remember going there in the 90s as a student, and one of the things I said to archaeologists digging there at the time, they were digging on the hill fort, and I said, I was talking about how this would have been a multi-ethnic community with people traveling from Sami, from across the Baltic, from all over. And one of them said, no, this was mainly Swedes. Mainly Swedes were here, living here, trading with all these other people, but they weren't here. Now, we've got isotope analysis out of a later urban settlement of Sigtuna showing us that a large fraction of those people were not from that immediate vicinity. Now, I'm not talking about their skin complexion. I'm not going to get into those arguments about what language they spoke, but we cannot think of, in my view now, despite that reaction 20 years ago to my comment, we cannot think about these settlements as full of local people. They would have been cosmopolitan, whatever that might mean in the Viking context. And the audiences for these funerals would have been complex. I can't imagine, we can't think about this as a static settlement. We can't think about this as a single ethnic group. They must have had complex audiences and complex compositions. And so whoever was burying in this way, they were making a statement not just to their family. They were projecting this out to a wider community of people coming in seasonally, people coming, traveling around the Baltic. They were talking to a wider audience in life and in death, I think, through what they were doing.
So maybe there's an international language of power behind the way these burials are structured.
Well, Frederick Svanberg said something very similar to that in his 2003 book about, the complexity of Viking burial practice. There's local traditions. There's local ways of doing things. There's local areas. Blekinge is different from Småland. It's different from Östergötland, all around Sweden and Denmark and all that. But there are these broader international connections. And I think, they are talking about power and identity on that broader tapestry. And I think they're aware of that. They're not parochial. But I still think there's something about the recent research is still insisting these are all local Swedes, Vikings, in a generic sense, who are doing all this. And given that some of those objects are showing way distant trade connections, surely we have to entertain one of the possibilities for BJ 581 and her kin is that these are actually the incomers. These are not people from Scandinavia at all. At least some of them may be actually the merchants that are coming from Slavic and further and steppe nomad backgrounds. And so we really have to, the whole ethnicity of that community needs to be re-questioned, re-evaluated. And I think we're still stuck in that rut of seeing Vikings who went out, Vikings who traded with others, who raided others. But I think it was a two-way process, as with colonialism always is.
And I think this is segue there in if I were to die somewhere far away, and my family, and you don't have the same abilities to transport bodies quickly or to preserve them, you're probably just going to bury someone where they fall. But that actually segues into a question by Merritt Burton down at the bottom. This may have been asked and answered already, but was it common for them to take the bodies of those who fell on battlefields back home to bury? Or were they left where they fell? Or on voyages raids, would the fallen have been taken back on the ship or buried before returning home?
Gosh. Well, that is a brilliant question, because we do have later Viking Age rune stones that are put up in parts of quite not particularly special rural districts of central Sweden commemorating people who are buried in Bath in the West Country of England. We have evidence that there, at least a fraction of the runestone tradition in the late Viking Age is commemorating people whose bodies couldn't come back from a long distance away. But were they actually bringing the bodies back? As corpses, I doubt it. As cremated remains, way earlier than the Viking Age, there's been arguments. A Norwegian-based archaeologist, Thea Østergaard, has argued that maybe some of these migration period, 5th, 6th century cremation urns, they weren't perhaps just trading the vessels. Oh, we've got a pretty vessel, high-status vessel, we'll bury our relative in this after we've cremated them. They may have actually been transporting the urns long distance. Now, I have no evidence to speculate that was happening in the Viking Age, but we've got to start looking for that possibility that at least in cremated form you could certainly transport the dead long distance. And one of the arguments for, I think, is medieval China of cremation is the ability of the popularity, at least of cremation in Sung Dynasty China, is the ability to transport the dead, and cremation does allow that transportability. It sounds a very modern, prosaic interpretation, but it's actually not. It links to the ability to return the dead, to make claims to land that may be in peril because, you know, of the crisis created by the deaths. So I'm not going to rule it out. We certainly got the Salma ship burials from the 8th century, if they can even be called Viking Age. They are now, but would they have been before? But mid 8th century, which look like we have a Swedish or Eastern Scandinavian expedition to what is now Estonia, that where they are disposing of the dead, presumably close to where they met a grisly end. But you know, we've got to keep open the possibility that some of the cremated dead may have been making a bit of a journey before they finally entered the ground. But that's all I can say, I'm afraid.
Sure, and I think that relates maybe to something people can relate to today about, like, oh, I want to be buried on, you know, on this place that's special to me, or this place that is connected to my family. But of course, at a time when, you know, you can't fly a body the same day, cremation might be your only option for doing.
We do have evidence from Greenland, I believe, from some of the church there, where we do have a mass charnel deposit, and one of the interpretations of that, I understand, is linked to the Greenland saga, where the idea that some sailors would actually retrieve the bodies of mariners, you know, on whaling trips or you know, and they would bring them back for Christian burial. But how far back? I mean, then you get into the interpretation of the famous Ingleby cremations at near Repton, and whether we're looking at some kind of burial site where they're bringing the dead long distance for burial. And indeed, Kat Jarman's work at Repton with the mass burial, the charnel deposit in the vicarage garden, could that be the burial of the dead of the great heathen army collected together over a number of seasons and buried in a Christian mausoleum? So there is, if there is evidence for that we don't have much backdrop to that. We don't have much evidence from Scandinavia of long distance transportation of bodies, but it's something archaeologists need to be on the lookout for.
Sure.
More.
Yeah. I think so often it's hard for us, again, to kind of get back into both the notion of understanding the society in which this is happening and the individual motivations that lie behind particular actions. Yeah. I have a question for you. Do you have an article that you would particularly recommend to orienting, you know, reasonably educated general public readers to bring them up to speed on mortuary practices in early medieval Northwestern Europe?
Wow, a single article.
Well, maybe not a single article, but where would you start someone who wanted to really get into this field?
Okay, if you want to get into early medieval burial archaeology, I'm going to have to, I could shamelessly, it's not a new book, but I did do a synthesis from about 13 years ago, available in paperback, Death and Memory in Early Medieval Britain. I deal with the Viking Age, but only in the context of the island of Britain. So I don't go into Scandinavia in it. But in terms of the ideas and some of the challenging concepts that I've been discussing, that book is the best place to start. But they're really, and I would say there's there's a lot of resources online. I'm happy to sort of produce a little sort of a short reading list, but I wouldn't say there's one other single article that I would look at. I've done a recent edition of the European Journal of Archaeology. Here it is in the background. Now this isn't open access, but I've got some stuff on my Academia Edu page that is open access of my article, my introduction to that, which I think will be quite useful for sort of giving an introduction to the latest thing. So my book is about a decade old. This is 2016, so this gives you, and it's about the Viking Age specifically. So I can make the link available to that chapter, and I think that'll be. That's reasonably. I sort of compile a lot of the resources. I don't have the Scandinavian languages at my disposal, but I do cover a lot of the English language material in that introductory article. So a book and an article.
All right, I think that's perfect for both for Patreon and, of course, over every semester, I rehaul my Norse myth class a little bit, and I've already been doing a week on afterlife and what I can get of the burial practices. And incorporating some more of this is something that I'm very interested in doing. So thank you. So that was about, we've had about an hour long discussion here. It's been very interesting for me.
That went quick.
Yeah, no. Well, you've made some excellent points. I think some points that reach even beyond the specifics of the archaeology of mortuary practices. Would anyone like to throw in another question or two? Do you have time?
I'm still happy. Yeah, I'm happy to go. I've got coffee. I'm all right.
Okay, you got coffee. That's a major factor. And by the way, you were a lot less shameless in promoting your book than I often am.
I wasn't going to do that, but look, it happened to be here. It just happened to be. No,
you need to have it appear glowing, kind of disembodied on the screen behind you.
Yes, exactly. I defer to your better technological knowledge than mine, but I think Neil Price is working on a Viking death book. He reprinted his Viking Way book. I do believe he may have a synthesis coming out in the next couple of years. So that will be definitely worth getting hold of, because he writes some really interesting stuff. And I don't agree with everything, as you can tell, I don't agree with everything he says, but I'm a great fan of his work because he's done some really inspiring research.
The Viking Way is really good.
Yeah.
Thought-provoking, certainly. Simon asks, do you think is it Haitian hogback depicts scenes from the Volsung myth?
Oh, wow. Well, you know what? I did a paper in the Haitian church there 2 years ago about that one hogback monument, because one of the other things I have done is written about Viking period stone sculpture. Oh, another book. There you are. So early medieval stone monuments. I have written about hogbacks, which are supposedly these Viking monuments. And the most crazy one of them all, in my mind, is the Hesham or Haitian. I get told off for calling it Haitian. Everyone calls it Haitian, but locals call it Hesham. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's on the it's on the Irish Sea coast, and it's this crazy hogback tomb, 10th, maybe early 11th century, which has these two panels on the side depicting scenes that have been seen to be one interpretation by I think it's Thor Ewing, argued that one side shows the Sigmund and his brothers being eaten by wolves. Is that right? Am I getting it wrong? And
that
then
would be right, yes.
Yeah, and then the other side is Sigurd slaying Fafnir by sticking his sword up into the belly of the beast. It's the problem is it's a crazy unique representation. There's nothing in Scandinavia. There's nothing in Christian art like it. It's mad. And so I suppose, like any art historian, any archaeologist, if you've got a unique object with unique scenes, how are you going to interpret it? And, you need an eye of faith to see the sword that Sigurd's supposedly stabbing into the belly of the dragon. And the dragon, you only have to see, it's the stone, the way it's been carved. You really, some people would say there's no dragon there. There's no serpent wrapping around the image. So it's really a worn monument. And some of the features that some people are happy to see there, you have to see with an eye of faith. So all I can see, I'm a naysayer again. I'm being miserable again. I'm saying, well, we have to be a bit careful. But come on, it's a unique monument. If you want it to be the Volsung saga, I'm happy for you to have that. But I think it's pushing it because we have nothing comparable. But then if I was going to flip that the other way, I would say you could say, well, you've got to have a bit of faith, because the story of Wayland, if we didn't have the 8th century whalebone casket, Northumbrian made, with the scene depicting the adoration of the Magi, so the three kings giving gifts to Christ, juxtaposed against a scene of Wayland giving the drugged drink is out seducing the king's daughter. Seducing is the polite term. Then we wouldn't know that Wayland was known in pre-Viking as a story. We wouldn't know that the story of Wayland was known in pre-Viking England. So
and that's Frank's casket, for those who don't know.
Sorry, I think so. Yeah, Frank's.
That is a really cool item, and it also has the headless bodies of the boys he killed.
Yes.
It has the smith tools. There's someone feeding chickens, which might relate to the detail in the Thitherek saga version that he made a sword out of metal shavings that he fed to chickens and that they defecated out. And then there's his brother Egil on the top of the casket shooting an arrow, which is also the Thitherek saga version. That is really cool.
But if we didn't have that one object, we wouldn't know that Wayland was known. So we have to keep that as an option, that some of these later stories may have an earlier version of them in 8th, 9th, 10th century. So Hisham Hogback, fabulous object. I've talked about it, but I haven't published on it yet, but it's a wonderful object. And there is a paper by Thor Ewing about it, but I'm a little bit more cynical about whether we can really see the same story on it.
Sure. Well, great. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, all of the Patreon supporters who came today. I know not everybody's time zone works out the same, so I know some of you had to really make time for it. Thank you very much. Professor Howard Williams, thank you very, very much for your time. Also for correspondence over the past couple months. And, I will put this, I will keep you updated about what I do with this file. I'm going to see if I can put it on YouTube.
Oh, that'd be great. I mean, it's great to have a conversation with these questions coming in. I have been trying to keep up with everyone, and thanks for all the complimentary comments. And but yeah, it'd be great if we could put this out there and see how it all goes.
Yeah. Hey, I mean, it's great information. You've made some excellent points about how much we read into cultures from like a grave, right? And how we may not even be reading in the right things. Right, we have to remember this is a culture that consists of individuals, but it may not be individual statements. It may be a broader cultural statement. You made so many excellent points. I mean, I'm going to have to digest this myself.
Well, but the cheeky thing about me is I'm commenting on the people's work with that, and I haven't written up my own mad theories about that grave. But I've got my mad theories about other graves, but you can read about them. But we're all trying very hard as archaeologists and researchers more broadly to interrogate this important period. And I think we've got to be cautious, but also we've got to sometimes push it a little bit, get ideas out there, and have those conversations, because that's the only way we take things forward.
Absolutely, and be informed by more of that worldwide and also diachronic context, and not just view everything in isolation.
Yeah, not a static one period culture. Yes.
Well, thank you again. Thank you, Patreon supporters. And for now, I wish everybody all the best.